Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. AP Euro Edition, I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And welcome back to our last lecture of the year, talking about economic recovery and unity in Europe from 1945 to about 2005. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, and jot down the lecture outline, paying particular attention to those key terms. And please note for this lecture, we'll pick up with point number 4, culture after World War II. Now that you have that, let's begin. Now remember, this is a unique lecture for a couple of reasons. Number one is it is the final lecture of the year. And secondly, most lectures I talk about and I go through is very chronological. In this case, though, we've had 2 lectures successfully about the Cold War, talking about from 1945 all the way to the present with the rise of Vladimir Putin. And of course, this lecture and the first half of this lecture and this lecture we're having right now are talking and going back to 1945 once again to discuss what else is going on politically, economically in Western Europe. And this particular lecture is going to talk about culture. So don't forget, we're going back to 1945 here, and we'll progress chronologically once again and talk about how culture changes and evolves in the post-World War II period. So let's begin. Now, post-World War II, there were tremendous changes in class structure and, of course, in social reform. Part of this, of course, was the creation of the welfare state, but there were other bigger trends as well. One of which, of course, was the tremendous rise of the middle class. And part of the main reason for this was one, economic boom, yes, but also the increased access to education. European society became more mobile, it became more democratic, and this new middle class was highly skilled, highly educated, more open, more democratic, but at the same time a little less secure than the old property classes, because remember, they don't have that long lineage of owning land or property. They don't own vast estates, rather they're living usually outside their means, buying things on credit, but surviving on the sustained economic growth we talked about during the first part of this lecture. Now, what we do see, though, is there is a less rigid class structure in Europe that develops. This is a trend throughout the world, as there's greater opportunity for upward mobility and somewhat downward mobility. The rapid industrialization, technological expansion created large corporations and government agencies. Again, whether these were private or the government had nationalized them, they did demand large numbers of not only workers, but also of managers and of scientists. And I don't just mean scientists as in the traditional ones you think, that are chemicals and such like that, but also ones who are scientists of how to work, how to get people to work more efficiently, how to manage time more efficiently. So there's many different branches of science here that are being employed. And during this period, these top managers and these high-ranking civil servants represent a new model for the middle class. These are salaried specialists. Again, this is largely service sector economy things. But they're well-paid, highly trained, skilled individuals who are working for a salary, not just for the old idea of an hourly wage. And many will pass on opportunity for advanced education to their children. Let me rephrase that. I think that came across wrong. Because of their new situation, they're able to pass on to their children a greater chance for higher education. So maybe they only got through high school, or maybe a bachelor's degree, maybe only associate's degree. But now they're able to let their children get the full bachelor or master's or even a PhD. At the same time, the lower classes became more flexible and open. Millions more rural workers were moved to urban cities. And the result is the drastic decline in one of Europe's most traditional and least mobile groups. The industrial working class ceases to expand, while at the same time, opportunities for the middle class, white collar, and service sector employees began to expand. The European governments, by creating the welfare state, helped to reduce class tensions because the government is now providing things that traditionally caused the class tensions, things like healthcare, family allowances, maternity grants, and now paternity as well, public housing. All these things would traditionally cause tremendous conflict between lower and working and lower class with the middle class. But when the government is saying, no, 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 these things are no longer privileges of only the middle and upper classes, but rather rights of all citizens, it reduces some of that traditional class tension that we talked about for the last 300 years. In its wake, instead, we see the rise of a new wave of consumerism. And we see consumerism being spread across the nation, as some people call it the quote-unquote gadget evolution or gadget revolution. The European automobile industry expands exponentially. Europeans are buying washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, radios, TV, stereos, and they're doing so on installment plans, i.e. credit cards. This increased social welfare, the welfare state, creates more disposable income and less need to save for old age. When you have Social Security looming for your retirement, you don't have to put aside so much money for your retirement. Rather, you are able to spend that money on having more disposable income to buy, well, stuff. It also creates greater leisure and recreation time. Soccer matches, horse races, movies, TV, exhibitions, commercialized hobby. Travel industry expands phenomenally. Europeans become one of the most highly demographic across the nation or across the globe to travel. Paid vacations are now required by law in most countries. Maternity and paternity leave allow new parents to spend time with their kids. Mandatory paid vacations allow people to take a break and go someplace new and experience a new culture. And again, I was shocked about 5 years ago. I was traveling just to the Grand Canyon. I was traveling to Hoover Dam. And the number one demographic I saw of people was usually European, not Americans. Now, of course, within this greater consumer culture, also saw the growth of youth movement and counterculture. And again, this parallels what we saw in the United States if you remember US history. This baby boom after World War II. These children who began growing up post-World War II who do not remember the war or remember the Depression. They don't remember fascism. They develop counterculture, rebelling against their parents, rebelling against authority figures, and rebelling against the general status quo. Remember, these youths are raised in relative economic prosperity. They were much more democratic and had greater fluidity in their class structure. They had greater access to education, yet they became much influenced by the revival of leftist thought, which created a counterculture. Again, the model for this, of course, was the United States. Youth in America took the lead in this. Youth rebelled against conformity of the 50s and 60s. They rebelled against the boredom of middle-class, whitewashed suburbs. And of course, one of the biggest kind of outlandish parts of this, or symbols of this, of course, was the rock and roll music. Now, of course, in the United States, people like Elvis Presley, yes, was considered race music. But even in Europe, bands like the Beatles, and of course, ultimately the British invasion, they became one of the biggest groups in music history throughout the world. So rock music also increased sexual behavior among many young people in the 60s and 70s. There was a kind of a sexual enlightenment or sexual revolution that took place in the 60s and 70s. And the age of the first sexual encounter dramatically reduced. And again, this corresponds not only with this mindset of rebelling against conformity, rebelling against parents, but also the advent of better reproductive protections, such as the pill. And there's a growing tendency of young unmarried people to live together on a semi-permanent basis, with even little thought to having kids or getting married. which of course is all troubling to the parent generation, but this is what the youth found as, well, their outlet. And we see an emergence of an international youth culture of the 1960s, linked together by mass communication. This baby boomer meant that youth became a part of an extremely large population that looked uneasy at the world in which they inherited of crass consumerism, fear of the nuclear bomb. And with this, they have increased education, increased liquidity, with greater access to money and prosperity. And they began to experiment not only with sex, but with music and, of course, chemical stimulants, drugs. And they began to employ these good jobs to use that extra money to experiment even more, whether it's on vacation or whether with more drugs. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, you see a number of student revolts across, well, the world. It's the United States, yes, but also in Europe. And this is largely in the 60s as a result in opposition to the US war in Vietnam. It triggers revolutionary ferment among youths. Again, this is influenced by that Marxist ideas, especially that was prevalent in French universities and the new left in the United States. And they believed the older generation and the United States that were fighting an immoral and imperialistic war in Vietnam. The students in Western Europe shared the US's youth rejection of materialism. They believed that post-war society had been repressive and flawed. They looked around at higher education. Yeah, we had greater access to higher education, but classrooms were overcrowded. There was little contact or one-on-one with professors. The competition for grades was intense. And demand for more practical areas of study to qualify for higher paying jobs after college. Doesn't that sound like our modern high school system today in the United States? The competition for grades is intense. Larger classrooms providing less one-on-one time with professors. Hey, look what we're doing right now. We're talking through a computer. And there's this push, maybe we need more practical hands-on education rather than just esoteric thinking. Well, we talked about the United States history last year. In this case, 1968, there will be a huge French student revolt. Students took over the university, leading to violent clashes with police and administrators. Most students demanded changes in the curriculum. They wanted a real voice, their voice, in running the university. They appealed to industrial workers for help, and a spontaneous strike, general strike, will spread across France as a result. To many, it seemed 1968 that the Fifth Republic in France might fall. But Charles de Gaulle will call in the national troops and call for new elections, which he will win decisively, and this mini revolution will collapse. But for much of that older generation in Western Europe, the student revolution of 1968 signaled the end of the illusions and the end of an era. This was the age of innocence that now was ending. And of course, the next period, 1970s, we'll see a tremendous recession in the 70s caused by the energy crisis. So that's the youth. What about women in this period? Women, especially during and after World War II, had brand new opportunities in the workplace. And they also have increased ability to attend higher education. And thus, the sharp increase across Europe and North America, the number of married women who become full and part-time wage earners outside the home drastically increases, largely as a result of World War II and increased liberal thought. Rising employment of married women became a powerful force in the drive for women's equality and ultimately emancipation. It also was a contributing factor to the decline in birth rate as well. When women were no longer in the home, there was less time to take care of children, and therefore people started having fewer children. And what develops here is a strong feminist, the second wave feminism, as we call it in the United States, but the feminist movement and the women's rights movement. And the two leaders of this, of course, were number one, Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex. 1949, she employs and outlines existentialist ideas. Remember, this is still the existentialist era of art. She argues that women were in essence free, but had almost always been trapped in particularly inflexible and limiting conditions, i.e., the male patriarchy. Only, so women only by being through courageous action and self-assertiveness and self-assertive creativity. So only by being courageous through courageous action and self-assertive creativity could women become truly free and escape the role of being the inferior other. Remember, for millennia, women had been considered inferior others, appendages to the man, appendages to their husband, arm candy, inferior, needing protection. And she argues that women need to step out, and only by being through courageous action and a self-assertive creativity would women finally step into their emancipated roles. And she will inspire a future generation of women's rights intellectuals, including the person on the right, Betty Friedan. In 1963, she writes The Feminine Mystique, and of course she's an American, but she's highly influenced by Beauvair's ideas on how the middle-class women were trapped in their domestic roles. She argued that women were expected to conform to false, infantile pattern of femininity, and to live for their husbands and children. Let me repeat that. She argues that women were expected to conform to an infantile pattern of femininity and only to live for their husbands and their children. And she argues that women are trapped in this, and they're feeling the weight of this, and they need to be released and thus emancipated, like Beauvair argued. And she founds the National Organization of Women now, in 1963, which will start facilitating the spread and growth of the European women's groups across the continent. Now, what are their goals? Well, they want new statute in the workplace that have laws against discrimination. They want equal pay for equal work. They want maternity leave and affordable daycare. So there are, again, 4 important things they want. They want laws against discrimination. If they're doing the same job as man, they should be hired the same. If they can do it, give them the job. They want equal pay for equal work, number 2. Number 3, maternity leave. And number 4, affordable daycare. Because one of the biggest, oppositions to women in the workplace, well, who will take care of the kids? Should the man do that? Maybe. But if you provide affordable daycare, then there's no excuse now not to hire women. And the result of this also included other things they wanted was the right to divorce. Especially in some Catholic countries that had still banned it. They wanted legalized abortion. They wanted the needs of single parent and protection. They wanted the needs of single parents, who were usually women, to be respected. Because often the case, if it's a single parent, most often it's the woman, especially in cases of divorce. Women often got custody of the children. They also wanted protection from rape and physical violence. For millennia, that unspoken, horrible thing was that men were able to perpetrate rape and sexual violence, but yet get away with it because, well, there's men being men, and there's a double standard between men and women. So they want laws to change to protect them. And in almost every country, the effort to legalize abortion inspired the creation of an effective women's movement. Now, will they get everything they want? No, we're still working on equal pay. But they will get things like maternity leave, which is something we're still working in the United States. So paid maternity leave. They want access to affordable daycare. They got all those things. The other big change in this period was in religion. Because one of the most important events of this period was the Second Vatican Council. From 1962 to 1965, the Second Vatican Council is considered the most important council of the Catholic Church since the Council of Trent back in the mid-1500s. So around 400 years, this is considered the most important Catholic council since the Council of Trent. And in this council, one of the biggest changes to the Catholic Church, it allowed the use of the vernacular in the Catholic liturgy. So the priest could preach and give the sermon and read from a vernacular Bible. If you're in Great Britain, it can be read in English, not in Latin. If you're in France, it can be read in French, not in Latin. Germany can be written, stated and written in German rather than in Latin. And again, what this does, it makes things more accessible to the common people, something the Protestants have been arguing since Martin Luther. And it finally takes place in 1962-1965 with the Second Vatican Council. Second outcome. So first outcome is use of vernacular for Catholic liturgy. Second outcome, Scripture declared to be the foundation of the Church. Think about that for a minute. We had a lot of discussion in this class over, is the Bible the final and sole authority, foundation of the Church, or is it Catholic and Church traditions that have been invented over the years? And this reaffirms that Scripture is indeed the basis and foundation of the Church. Third thing, it declares that although the Catholic Church was the one true church, remember Catholic means universal, other Christian groups who shared a belief in Christ were to be respected. Again, this is huge from a historical perspective. Now, it seems like, no duh, this is where it should have been all along. But from a historical perspective, we know how many wars have been committed between Protestant and Catholics, how much violence, how much animosity, how much racism, how much inferiority, superiority complex, how much division, how much death. But in the Second Vatican Council, they said, well, yes, Catholic Church is still the best, but all other Christian groups who believe in Jesus will also and ought to be respected. Again, these are three very big outcomes. So number one, vernacular, of using the vernacular for Catholic liturgy during service. Number two, Scripture is declared foundation of the Church. And number three, non-Catholics who are Christians deserve to be respected as well. And as a result, by the 21st century, Europe keeps going on a more secular streak, as in a poll in 2005, so that only 21% of Europeans believe that religion is, quote unquote, very important. And so despite these changes by the Vatican Council, there was still a downward trajectory in Europe when it came to religion in general. So let me repeat this. So despite these changes that were very positive for the Catholic Church, and of course this is the Catholic Church responding to centuries of turmoil and issues, they see that church membership and faith is declining in Europe. And so they do this in response. However, it does not do enough to stem the tide of secularism that had been growing and developing for, centuries in Europe. And again, this poll in 2005, only 21% of Europeans believe that religion is very important. Again, for comparison's sake, in 2005, in the United States, 59% of Americans believe that religion was very important. Only 21% in Europe. In fact, in 2004, a Gallup poll found that only 15% of Europeans attended church regularly, again, compared to 44% of Americans. Again, please note though, this is a European as a whole, but those numbers do vary from country to country. Countries where Catholicism was dominant did have significantly higher attendance, generally speaking, with one big exception, France. France, traditionally Catholic, but will have very low attendance numbers again, partly because of the very liberalist streak and secular streak that began as a result largely of Napoleon. And so we see all these major cultural shifts. Materialism, consumerism, yes. A rebelling against this with the youth revolts and the student protests. Women had their own moment in the sun with the feminist movement. And of course, religion does try to reform as well, but some may argue it was too little, too late in many respects. And with that, guys, I want to say thank you for a great year. It's been a pleasure teaching AP European history to you guys. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you everyone soon. But until then, take care. And until next time, bye-bye.